In this tutorial, I will show you how to deploy a Docker container to AWS Elastic Container Service, and we will do this using SST, a free and open source infrastructure as code tool. It allows us to define our AWS resources in code similar to Terraform, but at a higher level of abstraction, so it's much more user-friendly. With SST, we will be able to deploy this container to AWS with just about 35 lines of code, and you can use it to build out complex systems of AWS services, but for this video, we're going to be doing a simple demo of deploying one Docker container. There's a few things you'll need to follow along with this tutorial. The first is the AWS CLI, and this just allows us to execute AWS commands from our terminal. So you'll need to install this and configure your AWS account to connect to it. And you'll also need to install SST, and you can do that just by going to their website here and running this command. And you'll need a Docker container to deploy. So for me, I have this simple weather app that I built using Elixir and React, and here's the Docker file for it. And as you can see, I'm running it on my local machine here. This is what it looks like. It's just a simple weather app. You can check the weather for any city in the US. Now that we have AWS and SST installed, we need to initialize our SST app. So I'm going to go over to the terminal and type SST init. We're going to continue, and we're going to select AWS. Now if we go back to our code, we can see that a sst.config.ts file has been generated, and this is where we're going to write our infrastructure as code. To start writing the code for our AWS services, we can go back to the SST website and grab some of their example code. So let's go to the docs, and then on the left bar we'll scroll down to container, and then we can skip this. We already have a container. This is the code we need right here. So as you can see, we're going to define a VPC. Inside that VPC, we're going to define a cluster. And then within that cluster, we're going to add a service for our container. So let's copy this code. Go over to VS Code, and in this run function, we're going to paste this code. And now I'm just going to update these names to reflect my application. So I've updated the names of these services, and I've also done a couple more things. One, I've added this second parameter to our VPC, which is just providing the option of manage NAT. And then in our dev block here, I've updated the command to reflect my application, which is a Phoenix application. And so now if we go back into our terminal, we can run SST dev, and this should spin up our application in dev mode. We also need to add a port forwarding. So my code is running on port 4000, so we need to forward that to port 80. So since that was the first time we were running dev on our application, it went ahead and created all of our AWS infrastructure for us, like the VPC and all the related services. And it took a couple minutes, and here we can start to see the magic of SST, as just by defining a VPC, it went ahead and created all of the related services that we need for that, like all the subnets, route tables, etc. And our application is now running locally. If we go over to the weather service tab, we can see my application is running here on my local machine. So our application is now ready to be deployed on AWS. So I'm going to Control-C out of there, and we're going to run SST deploy --stage, and I'm going to label my stage as production. And SST has a built-in feature here for different environments. So here we're going to deploy a production environment, but you could also deploy a development environment and have those both running at the same time. And here we go. Our application is spinning up. This might take a couple minutes. And there we go, a few minutes later, and our service is now live on AWS and ready for us to visit. So let's go check it out. And here we can see our weather app has successfully been deployed to AWS. And it works exactly the same way. We can select the weather for any city in the US. And we can see SST made that whole process so easy. we were able to get a Docker container up on AWS in just a few minutes. And it was very similar to a tool that I also made a video on called AWS Copilot, but where SST really shines over Copilot is that it is extensible with the rest of AWS. So while Copilot is mostly just focused on containers, as you can see with SST, you can really spin up any sort of AWS infrastructure that you need. So in future videos, I'll go more in depth on this and we can build out some more complex systems on AWS using SST. But for now, there we go. We have our container deployed on AWS.